Shortly before 4:30 p.m. local time on Tuesday, July 28, 2026, the ground beneath Kumamoto Prefecture on Japan's southern island of Kyushu ruptured with a force strong enough to register a maximum intensity of 7 on the Japanese seismic scale, the highest level that scale has. In the chaotic hour that followed, a shopping mall partially collapsed, then exploded. A 400-year-old castle's ancient stone walls came down on camera. A cargo train derailed and lay on its side. And in the days since, as dashcam footage, aerial video, and eyewitness recordings have continued surfacing from across the disaster zone, a much fuller and more specific picture of exactly what happened during those first catastrophic minutes has come into focus. This wasn't simply a strong earthquake. It was a magnitude 7.1 event that Japan's own seismic network has now tied to more than 7,300 recorded aftershocks, a slip model showing up to 2.4 meters of fault displacement, and a death toll that climbed sharply once a suspected gas explosion tore through an already damaged shopping center. Today, we're going through exactly what the newly surfaced footage actually shows, what the scientific data tells us about how this earthquake ruptured, and why this specific region of Japan carries a history that makes this event especially significant to the researchers studying it. Drop a comment right now. If you were in Japan when this happened, or you have family or friends in Kyushu, tell me how they're doing. And if you want the update the moment new information comes out of Kumamoto, subscribe right now. It's free. A thumbs up helps enormously. Let's get this to 5,000 likes so it reaches the people who need to see it. Now let's break down what actually happened. The moment the ground gave way, the magnitude 7.1 earthquake struck Kumamoto Prefecture with an epicenter that Japan's meteorological agency placed at a shallow depth. The kind of shallow rupture that concentrates violent shaking directly at the surface rather than allowing depth to absorb and dissipate the energy before it reaches populated areas. The intense shaking, registering at the maximum level 7 on the Japanese intensity scale, hit Kashima and the surrounding Kumamoto communities directly, triggering an immediate temporary tsunami advisory that was lifted once the initial risk assessment cleared. Local and national broadcasters, including NHK, began airing footage within minutes showing the immediate chaos, buildings damaged, streets cracked, residents pouring outside as the shaking continued. Over 260,000 residents across the affected region were advised to evacuate as emergency services mobilized. Aerial footage that emerged in the hours after the quake showed a derailed cargo train lying on its side, collapsed towers at an industrial facility, and a building already burning. A visual record of just how immediately widespread the physical damage was across the region, not concentrated in a single location, but scattered across the broader Kumamoto disaster zone. The Aeon Mall collapse and the explosion that followed. The single most devastating sequence of events during this disaster centered on the Aeon Mall shopping center in Kashima. During the initial shaking, part of the mall's structure gave way, with the second floor collapsing and trapping people inside as shoppers and staff scrambled to get out. This alone would have made the mall the focal point of the entire disaster response. But roughly 30 minutes after the earthquake struck, while rescue crews were still working to reach people trapped in the wreckage, a massive secondary explosion, suspected to have been caused by ruptured gas lines running through the damaged structure, tore through the complex. Dashcam footage that surfaced in the days following the quake captured the exact moment of that explosion. A sudden, violent eruption of fire and debris from a building that had already been partially collapsed minutes earlier. That footage has become one of the defining visual records of this disaster, precisely because it captures, in real time, the compounding danger that defines the most severe earthquake disasters. A structure that survives the initial shaking in a critically weakened state, only to fail completely once a secondary hazard, in this case ruptured gas infrastructure, finishes what the earthquake started. Officials have confirmed at least 23 people were killed in connection with the mall explosion and collapse, with dozens more injured and the number of people still missing remaining unclear in the immediate aftermath. Notably, the Aeon Mall had only recently reopened after being rebuilt, following a previous deadly earthquake in the same region roughly a decade earlier, a detail that underscores just how directly this specific location has now been struck by catastrophic seismic damage twice within about 10 years. Kumamoto Castle, 4 centuries of history, captured on camera in real time. Beyond the human toll, one of the most visually striking pieces of footage to emerge from this disaster shows the historic Kumamoto Castle, a roughly 400-year-old landmark and one of the most significant historic structures on Kyushu, sustaining severe structural damage as the earthquake struck. Video captured major sections of the castle's ancient stone walls crumbling and falling during the shaking, a visual record of a structure that has stood through centuries of Japanese history being visibly damaged in real time by a modern seismic event. Kumamoto Castle has already been through a difficult decade. having sustained significant damage during the 2016 Kumamoto earthquake sequence, and undergone a long, careful restoration process since. This new damage represents a genuine setback to that restoration effort and adds the castle to the long list of structures across the region now facing renewed assessment and repair. What the seismic data actually shows, behind the footage, the scientific data paints a detailed picture of how this earthquake actually ruptured. USGS's preliminary slip model for the event shows up to 2.4 meters of slip along the fault, translating to roughly a meter of eastward ground motion along a fault oriented on a northeast-southwest axis. Japan's meteorological agency recorded more than 7,300 aftershocks in the aftermath of the magnitude 7.1 main shock, an extraordinarily high number that reflects both the scale of the initial rupture and the complexity of the fault network beneath this specific region. Of those aftershocks, 3 exceeded magnitude 5 and 29 fell between magnitude 4 and 5, a genuinely significant secondary hazard layered on top of an already catastrophic main shock, since aftershocks of that scale are fully capable of causing additional damage to structures already weakened by the initial event. The distribution of those aftershocks tells its own story. They stretched from the town of Mashiki in the north down into the offshore region south of Yatsushiro, suggesting the rupture likely continued offshore at depth, even if it may not have broken the surface across that entire span. Seismologists studying the aftershock distribution, mapped by depth and projected onto a cross-section running northwest to southeast, have noted the seismicity dipping toward the northwest, consistent with the geometry of a fault plane extending down into the northwest beneath the region, the kind of detailed subsurface picture that only becomes clear once enough aftershock data has accumulated to map it properly. Why Kumamoto specifically carries extra weight for seismologists? This is not the first time this exact region has produced a major damaging earthquake, and that history is central to why scientists are studying this event with such close attention. In 2016, Kumamoto Prefecture was struck by a devastating sequence that included a magnitude 7.0 main shock, killing dozens of people and causing extensive, long-lasting damage across the prefecture, including the earlier damage to Kumamoto Castle that took nearly a decade to substantially repair. That 2016 sequence remains a critical reference point for Japanese seismologists precisely because it demonstrated how the complex multi-segment fault networks running through this part of Kyushu can rupture in stages, with earlier smaller earthquakes sometimes acting as precursors to a larger event that follows within hours or days. The fact that this same general region has now produced a second catastrophic earthquake within roughly a decade is exactly the kind of pattern that keeps researchers from treating any single Kumamoto earthquake as a fully closed, isolated event. It reinforces the understanding that this specific corner of Kyushu sits above a genuinely active and complex fault system capable of repeated, significant rupture on a timescale far shorter than many other seismically active regions experienced between major events. How Japan's response compares to the scale of the disaster. Even amid a disaster of this scale, the elements of Japan's earthquake response infrastructure that this channel has covered before were visibly active throughout. The evacuation advisory covering over 260,000 residents moved quickly. Tsunami advisories were issued immediately and lifted once risk assessment cleared. Emergency services mobilized fast enough that rescue operations at the Aeon Mall were already underway before the secondary gas explosion struck, which is precisely why that explosion proved so devastating. It struck during an active rescue effort rather than before help had arrived. None of that infrastructure prevented the disaster or the loss of life this event caused, and a death toll of at least 23 confirmed at the mall alone reflects a genuinely severe outcome. But the speed and organization of the response, evacuation orders, emergency mobilization, and rapid public information sharing through outlets like NHK and Kyoto News reflects the same institutional preparedness this channel has highlighted in prior Japanese seismic events, even when, as this one shows clearly, the preparedness cannot eliminate catastrophic outcomes entirely when a shallow, high-intensity rupture strikes directly beneath a populated, structurally vulnerable location. What comes next for the region? In the near term, Kumamoto faces an extended recovery process layered on top of an active, still elevated aftershock sequence, with JMA's monitoring network continuing to track whether the more than 7,300 recorded aftershocks decay in the pattern typically expected following a main shock of this size, or whether elevated activity persists longer than usual given this region's documented history of staged rupture behavior. Structural assessments across the region, including a fresh evaluation of Kumamoto Castle's now compounded damage, will take considerable time, and the rebuilding of the Aeon Mall complex, already rebuilt once after the 2016 disaster, raises real questions about long-term reconstruction approaches for critical commercial infrastructure sitting in a zone with this specific seismic history. The footage that has emerged from Kumamoto over the past 2 weeks tells a story that raw magnitude numbers alone never fully capture. A partially collapsed mall turning into a fatal explosion during an active rescue effort. 4 centuries of stone castle wall crumbling on camera. A cargo train thrown from its tracks. Behind that footage sits a genuinely significant seismic event. A magnitude 7.1 rupture producing thousands of aftershocks across a fault system that has now produced 2 catastrophic earthquakes in roughly a decade. Understanding what actually happened during those first minutes and why this specific region keeps producing events of this severity matters for exactly the same reason all of the seismic stories we cover on this channel matter, because the difference between a serious earthquake and a genuine catastrophe keeps coming back to the same handful of factors: depth, timing, structural vulnerability, and what happens in the critical minutes immediately after the ground stops shaking. We'll keep tracking the recovery and any new developments out of Kumamoto as they come in. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And drop that comment. Do you have any connection to this region? Or has this changed how you think about earthquake risk where you are? Let's get this to 5,000 likes so it reaches the people who need to see it. See you in the next one.